Today we're going to be talking about evaluating some of the sources that Richard Bushman uses in Rough Stone Rolling to promote this new narrative, this new idea that Joseph Smith was this boy who engaged in treasure digging, that this was part of his family culture growing up. And we're going to see, is there merit to this? What is going on with these sources? And how should Latter-day Saints feel about this new narrative? Welcome everyone to this vidcast on debunking Rough Stone Rolling's treasure digging sources with real data. This is part of the Joseph Smith Foundation vidcast, and today we're going to be talking about evaluating some of the sources that Richard Bushman uses in Rough Stone Rolling to promote this new narrative, this new idea that Joseph Smith was this boy who engaged in treasure digging, that this was part of his family culture growing up. And we're going to see, is there merit to this? What is going on with these sources, and how should Latter-day Saints feel about this new narrative? So let's go ahead and let's just dive right in. So before we can really get started and jump into this discussion, we need to lay down some basic groundwork and just make sure we're on the same page on some basic facts. First of all, for over 190 years, the church and every leader's position was that Joseph Smith was not involved with money digging. This is very important because some people don't realize that the church wasn't just silent on this issue. Leaders weren't just silent, and it wasn't as if members weren't aware that this idea was even out there. It's not as if this is so new. For 190 years, presidents of the church like Joseph F. Smith and others, they knew that there were people out there claiming that Joseph Smith was involved in treasure digging. And you know what they said? They said, that's nonsense. That's crazy. Not true. It's completely false. Well, in recent times, in the last decade or so, what's interesting is we're actually seeing that position is shifting. We're seeing a big discussion and debate among members of the church from within, really debating and saying, well, were we right to maintain that position for over 190 years? Or do we need to change? In the words of Richard Bushman, who of course is the author of Rough Stone Rolling, in a book, Joseph Smith and the Beginnings of Mormonism, he said, Joseph Smith is increasingly being looked upon as the lazy son of a money digger. That's the new narrative. So that's really what we're going to talk about today. Was Joseph Smith a noble, hardworking, industrious, God-fearing Christian young man? Or instead, was he a lazy son of a money digger? So let's dive into this and let's see what the facts say. So you have these two sides. On the one side, you have the money digging side, and you have all of the progressive scholars. And on the other side, on the traditionalist side, you have those who say, no, the treasure digging narrative is not true. And on the traditionalist side, you have all of the presidents of the church up to the last 10 years or so. You have traditionalist scholars, and of course, you have us with the Joseph Smith Foundation. We are definitely staunch at the forefront on the traditionalist side. This discussion over this new narrative is being hotly debated right now. On March 11th, 2021, there was a Zoom meeting among different historians, and three prominent historians were leading this discussion. There was Dr. Benjamin Park, Dr. Christina Rossetti, and Dr. Robin Jensen. And the discussion was centering on Mark Hoffmans Forgeries, the new Netflix documentary that just came out in 2021. And they were asked the question, you know, we have this narrative about Joseph Smith being involved in different kind of magical activities, being involved in treasure digging. How normalized is that among members? Are members embracing it? Have they accepted it? Is the discussion and debate closed? What's going on? And it was interesting because Dr. Christina Rossetti, all three of them acknowledged that the discussion is still going on, but Dr. Christina Rossetti made the observation that we need to recognize that there are members of the church who are seriously struggling with this new narrative. They're not just struggling, but they're feeling betrayed, and this is contributing to the faith crisis that we see going on within the church. And she mentioned that not only are there some members who are struggling, but there are traditionalist members who are pushing back, who are saying, nope, we don't buy this new narrative. We're not jumping on board with this bandwagon and pushing back. And it's interesting because she actually specifically mentioned the Joseph Smith Foundation and the work that we are doing, and acknowledged that there is still a discussion going on, and we need to recognize and be understanding of that.
If people want an example, I have an example because I was just watching it. The Joseph Smith Foundation, the Stoddard family, they have just released a book and videos on that the seer stones were not used to translate the Book of Mormon. So there is also a reactionary historical narrative that is very proudly happening. They also have spoken out against Leonard Arrington and kind of everything we've talked about. So if you are interested in what that strand of history is doing, the Joseph Smith Foundation has talked a lot against that narrative and that normalization.
Now, one thing I do want to mention is, obviously, Dr. Rossetti completely differs from us in our approach to this history and our understanding and our conclusions. But I want to just say that I do appreciate her tone. She was very respectful, and she was very professional in the way that she approached the answer to that question. So I just want to just take off my hat to her for that. But Dr. Rossetti acknowledged what is going on. This is a discussion that is hotly being debated. Right now, this is a battle that is raging, and a lot of people have loved ones who are leaving the church, or they have a loved one who says, I'm struggling with elements of the church history, or I just learned about this and I am not settled. It is not okay with me. And they are feeling betrayed. They're feeling like they grew up in primary being told that Joseph Smith was this amazing man and singing praise to the man. And now they're feeling like, wait, he was literally almost a loser, really a scumbag who was out there digging treasure with the lowlifes of society, the lowest society members. And when I say lowest society members, I mean that in terms of Christian values and character. And so members are not feeling okay with this, and they're feeling betrayed. And so Dr. Rossetti, who herself is a progressive scholar, she was very respectful, though, and she acknowledged we need to realize that this new narrative is causing a faith crisis among many people, that many people are struggling with it. And many members are not just struggling with it, but they're pushing back and they're resisting. So this is a debate that's going on right now. The case is not closed. It's not as though, this is just a done and settled debate. This is literally a battleground that is happening right now as we are sitting here. And the question at the end of the day is, what are the facts? What is the truth? As a traditionalist, I value truth. And I do value sources and facts. If Joseph Smith could be shown to have been a treasure digger, if he can be shown to have had background in magic and the occult, I would be the first person to say that we need to acknowledge it, we need to rewrite our history, and we need to move forward and apologize for our incorrect narrative of the past. And honestly, with all of the implications, it doesn't matter if it makes us feel uncomfortable. It doesn't matter if it doesn't fit with what we want to hear. All that matters is what is truth. And that's what we need to be asking ourselves. What is the truth? And pursuing that truth no matter where the evidence leads. So the question is, what are the sources that they're using to push this new treasure digging narrative? And are those sources legitimate? And do we need to rewrite our history? Do we need to look and investigate all of the implications of that new history? Well, as a traditionalist, I'm here to say the treasure digging sources that Richard Bushman used in Rough Stone Rolling are not credible, and this is why. Let's go into that. So there was a study that was done in 1993 by a man named Donald L. Enders. And Enders, what he did is he decided to approach this really from a new angle. You see, people have been discussing and debating this for decades, right? And some people have been saying, Mormonism Unveiled is accurate and it really needs to be given careful consideration. And then you have others who say, no, it's hogwash, throw out the whole thing. And Enders said, okay, let's go and look at the affidavits in Mormonism Unveiled and other statements published in other anti-Mormon publications, other statements made alleging that Joseph Smith was involved in treasure digging. We're going to look at all of those, he said, and then let's test it against all of the available historical data we have. Let's analyze the land and tax records. Let's look at the farm account books. Let's look at soil surveys and archeological records, and those are scientific. Those are facts, because we can debate opinion all day long. I can sit here and explain maybe why I think a source is biased, and I could talk to a progressive and they can explain why they don't think it's biased. And we can go back and forth all of day long and debate arguments that sure have merit. But at the end of the day, if we can test these statements against scientific data, we're talking about data that is black and white, and isn't subject just to someone's emotional interpretation, then maybe we can really evaluate and actually close the case of whether these affidavits and these statements are authentic. Can we authenticate or disprove them? And that is what Enders did, which was a brilliant idea. So what was Enders' result? What was the end of that research? Well, before we go into that, then let's just talk for a moment just about why we're having this discussion at all, and if it even matters. Because at the end of the day, I can sit here and I can talk all day long about boring surveys and tax records and analysis and data driven studies and bore all of you to tears. But at the end of the day, if it doesn't matter, then maybe we need to find something better to do with our time. So let's talk about this for a moment. So I started talking at the beginning about how this shift has occurred, about how for over 190 years, the church is saying one thing. They're saying this treasure digging narrative is nonsense and you don't need to worry about it. And now we're seeing this shift among all of these scholars and a lot of members who are feeling troubled, feeling like actually that narrative did have merit all along, and we need to give it some careful consideration. So how did this shift occur? We didn't just happen overnight. How did this happen? Well, it goes back to Richard Bushman. Richard Bushman made a statement that was very interesting about this shift and his own role in it. He said, the response of Mormon historians in the 1970s was to deny almost everything. They argued all the money-digging stories were fabrications of Joseph Smith's enemies, end quote. So who are we talking about first? For a moment here, we're going to pause. Who are these historians who are denying almost everything? Okay, so these would be historians like Joseph Fielding Smith, Hugh Nibley, and others who said, this is hogwash, and we're not even going to give it the time of day other than doing different pieces trying to show why it's nonsensical. But Richard Bushman said, I don't agree with that. I think that these sources need to be given consideration. So back to Bushman, he said the Mormon historians, claimed that the sources for the stories were corrupted and therefore not to be trusted. Most of the accounts came from a set of affidavits collected by Philastus Hurlbut. Now, that's important because if you have read any of our books or you've seen any of our presentations, you're probably familiar with the story of Dr. Philastus Hurlbut. And if you're not, I encourage you to check out that history. You can get the full details with our book, Seer Stone v. Urim and Thummim, or you can get the Faith Crisis books. There's pieces of the story in there as well. But that's a very entertaining story about Hurlbut and the origin of Mormonism Unveiled. In a nutshell, Hurlbut was the one who swore that he would wash his hands in Joseph Smith's blood after he was excommunicated from the church for immorality. He'd already been excommunicated from 2 other Christian denominations for the same problem, and then he ended up joining the church in the days of Joseph Smith, was caught, ended up getting excommunicated, and he was so angry, he went ballistic, and he said he wanted to wash his hands in Joseph Smith's blood. That's a direct quote, by the way. And he said, and then he was funded and paid to actually go back east and dig up all the dirt he could find on the Smiths. Well, he digs up all the dirt, but he's not able to publish it under his own name because before he can get them published, he actually ended up being convicted for threatening Joseph Smith's life in court. And then, so that didn't work out too well. So he had to shift all of his research and material over to a man named E.D. Howe, who published the book Mormonism Unveiled. Anyways, the full detail behind that story and what happened to E.D. Howe and how he got involved in spiritualism and ended up abandoning Christianity. And Hurlbut may have been guilty later on for manslaughter and thievery. It's quite the drama. But that's Hurlbut. And that's Hurlbut's affidavits. So for decades, all of these Mormon historians were saying that research is nonsense and we're not going to trust it. Well, then here Bushman comes along in the 1970s and he says, you know, I'm a scholar, and as a scholar, I need to give this credibility. He says, church historians thought Hurlbut's motives were too suspect to trust his findings. What reason was there to believe him, right? So all of these other historians had been like, Hurlbut, sorry, he is not the most reliable source. We're not going to trust the affidavits he produces. And people like Willard Chase, who led the mob to help kill Joseph Smith and steal the plates, essentially. That's a whole nother story. But that's where these stories are coming from. So they're not trusting it. And Bushman says, I have to trust these stories. So he says, the first thing I decided was that I couldn't dismiss all of Hurlbut's affidavits just with a wave of a hand. He says, no, I'm not going to do that. We gotta bring Hurlbut in, bring Mormonism Unveiled in, and let's give it the respect it deserves. He says, academic historians had taken them seriously, and so should I. So Richard Bushman, he goes and he writes his material. He writes books like Joseph Smith and the Beginnings of Mormonism, and then later Rough Stone Rolling, and really spirals this new narrative, this new look at Joseph Smith. And by new, what we mean is, the stories have been around since before the church was even organized. So these aren't new claims, but new in the sense of being introduced to members as something that they should accept as truth, whereas before they were discounted as simply the lies of Joseph Smith's enemies. So how did Bushman do? What was his success? Well, Bushman says, quote, I occasionally hear of people who are still offended by a prophet who dealt in treasure-seeking, but very few. The most important issue when I began to write in the 1970s has faded in importance. Even highly Orthodox Latter-day Saints are not offended by treasure-seeking and seer stones. Now, of course, though, from the discussion that we saw with those historians, with Dr. Rossetti and Dr. Robin Jensen, and just looking at discussions on social media and a lot of other points of evidence, I think we can disagree with Bushman in saying that, even the highly Orthodox Latter-day Saints have just adopted and brought this in. The discussion and the debate is very much alive and very much going on right now. However, what Richard Bushman acknowledged is that he produced this new narrative and that members are being forced to accept it as if it is true. But the question that we need to be asking ourselves right now is, who cares? Why does this matter? Because, again, if it doesn't matter and we don't care, then there's a lot of more entertaining things that all of us could be doing besides watching this discussion right now. But we need to ask ourselves, does this issue even matter, or is it not a big deal? Because a lot of progressives will tell you it doesn't matter whether Joseph Smith had a career in treasure digging. It doesn't matter if he dabbled in magical and occultic practices. It's just not a big deal. Well, is it? Let's turn to our evangelical friends, other fellow Christians, who will tell you very much it does matter. And they are very disturbed by this idea that Joseph Smith was involved in treasure digging. In fact, it is causing a serious stumbling block for members investigating the church, individuals and Christians who would maybe otherwise be open to the Book of Mormon and otherwise be open to the church, are being turned away, and they are getting a false image of who Joseph Smith was by this new narrative. So again, what Bushman says is, yeah, Joseph Smith had this dark past and he really had to extricate himself from the schemes of the Palmyra magicians and the money diggers. And he says at times his closest followers and his own family was confused. So he said, we need to see Joseph Smith as someone who outgrew his culture. Well, if you look online at different memes and just responses, they recognize, wait a minute, this narrative doesn't add up. They say, wait a minute, you're telling me that Joseph Smith claimed that at 14, he sees the Father and the Son, and God tells him to start the true church and teaches him the truth. And then what does Joseph do? He goes and spends the next 10 years treasure hunting? That just doesn't make sense. If Joseph Smith is this prophet called of God at 14, then why is he spending the next 10 years of his life associating with literally the scum of society in treasure digging? It just makes no sense. And John Dehlin recognizes this, and he is capitalizing on it. John Dehlin is the owner of Mormon Stories and Mormon Stories podcast. And a few years ago, he started a billboard campaign. And it's interesting that one of the first billboards that he went and put up on I-15 read, was Joseph Smith a treasure digger? I mean, of all the issues, think of everything he could have picked. The Book of Abraham and polygamy and different issues about Freemasonry, maybe DNA in the Book of Mormon. There's so many different issues that he could have said to get people questioning and going to his resources and his podcast. But no, he picked treasure digging. Was Joseph Smith a treasure digger? Because John Dehlin realizes that this issue alone is driving members out of the church. It's leading to the greatest apostasy since Kirtland. And this is something that actually scholars within the church have acknowledged. Daniel Peterson, who works at BYU, he acknowledged that the character of Joseph Smith matters. It matters if he was a treasure digger. It matters if he was in the occult. Daniel Peterson said, the character and claims of Joseph Smith are fundamental to the claims of the church he founded. Knowing this, critics of the prophet have contended for more than a century and a half that he and his family were the kind of people from whom nobody would want to buy a used car, much less receive a plan of salvation. In other words, what Daniel Peterson is saying is if Joseph Smith was a man of character, that matters. That lends credibility to the gospel that he gave. If he was not a man of character, that calls the entire restoration of the gospel into question. It calls the Book of Mormon and everything else into question. Because think about it. Would you buy a used car from a bumbling idiot who is dishonest and running around with money diggers and treasure hunters and dabbling in occultic practices? Why would you trust him to buy a used car? And if you wouldn't trust him to buy a used car, why are you going to trust him with your plan of salvation, your plan to get back to God? It just doesn't make sense. And again, John Dehlin recognizes this. Because who does he use on his main website? If you go to the Mormon Stories website, front page, just front and center, he has profile pictures to draw people in. And one of those profile pictures right there is Richard Bushman, alongside with other individuals like Greg Prince and Carolyn Pearson. These are members of the church, folks. This is not as though this is all just anti-Mormons and excommunicated crazies. These are scholars within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And John Dehlin is recognizing that this narrative that they're pushing is not keeping people in the faith. It's not strengthening their testimony in Joseph Smith. It's doing the complete opposite. In several of the podcasts that he has filmed, when he sets up his backdrop, which again, your backdrop is going to reflect your message. It's going to reflect the environment that you want people to feel. Guess what John Dehlin uses for his backdrop? He used rough stone rolling along with Fawn Brody's No Man Knows My History. But Richard Bushman's rough stone rolling is right there. And a lot of people, sometimes people will say, well, I heard Rough Stone Rolling is this great book. If someone's struggling with their testimony, then we're supposed to give them this book. I've heard this book will help them. Well, my question to them is, then why is John DeLynn promoting Rough Stone Rolling as one of his top books when John DeLynn's top motivation is to lead people out of the church, not keep them in? It's clearly due to this magical worldview. The magical worldview is huge. It is one of the most fundamental issues at heart in this faith crisis. Again, what we're discussing is this new narrative, this idea that Joseph Smith was a boy who gazed into stones and saw treasure, that grew up to become a translator who looked in a stone and saw words, right? Joseph Smith goes and uses this stone for occultic purposes and treasure digging. And then he says, oh, I'm a prophet of God now, so I'm going to take that stone and go and use it for God's work, and there's no problem. And that's where the Book of Mormon came from. That doesn't sit right. Richard Bushman says it may have taken 4 years after Moroni appeared for Joseph to purge himself of his treasure-seeking greed. So we've got Joseph Smith here with treasure-seeking greed. Joseph never repudiated the stones or denied their power to find treasure. Remnants of the magical culture stayed with him to the end, right? So here's Joseph Smith giving us the temple endowment. Here's Joseph Smith in Liberty Jail, and here's Joseph Smith in Carthage Jail, ready to lay down his life. And here he is with all of these remnants of magical culture and occultism hanging on to him, influencing him, and defining who he is as a prophet of God. This completely changes the way we see the restoration. Because from a Rough Stone Rolling perspective, magic had served its purpose in his life. In a sense, it was a preparatory gospel. So not only is it part of his life, but it's actually supposed to have helped him be a better prophet. It prepared him for the priesthood. It was a preparatory gospel. This is the progressive narrative. And again, the question we need to ask ourselves is, where did this come from? And is it true? Because if it's true, we all need to face the facts and we need to reassess our belief system. But if it's not true, then we need to become aware of the facts, become informed, and then we need to go out and we need to spread the truth. So what if we test Bushman's new narrative against real scientific data? So if you're interested in getting more details, if you are interested in getting the footnotes and the sources, more of the nitty-gritty details and more stories, you can go get a copy of Faith Crisis 2, Behind Closed Doors. Chapter 16, Fact-Checking Bushman's Innuendo with Real Data, is where we go into Donald Ender's study and some of the highlights of what Enders found when he decided that he was going to take those affidavits and he was going to test them against real facts and real scientific data.